Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, and what? Thank you for watching. So this is day 11, part D of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And I will reread the sentence because I actually didn't finish it because I got sidetracked. But before I do that though, there was one thing that I wanted to add about getting the reparations, right? Because you have to think about it. What I've learned in here was that, and when I say legally bound, right? And so what I mean by that is not just by wills, but I'm talking about by countries, because earlier on, Washington and all those other people before wanted to get rid of their slaves, wanted to free them, right? But Britain was like, you can't do it. A country tells you can't do something. I'm just saying. So like when you go for the reparations, you have to literally trace it all the way back, not just to who bought the slaves initially, but you have to see if they wanted to free them, but the country wouldn't allow for that to happen, because there are times when they had the money to free them, but people like Britain was like, that's against the law, you can't do that, you have to keep them. You see what I mean? So you do have your people that they were greedy or whatever, and they're like, nope, that's my property, that's my rightful property, whatever. Or no, we have too many crops, there's no way we're going to be able to harvest these. Switching over to machinery is too expensive, or whatever it is, so we have to keep them on hand or whatever. And then you have the people that were like that, but they're like, yes, but we treat them well, right? Or people that wanted to free them altogether but didn't have the money to do so. And then, like I said before, they would sell, not sell, they would free one, and then the freed person would then take over ownership of all their family members so that they were still living a free life. And then there was the ones that they still owned them, but they allowed the slaves to live completely free out in the communities and stuff. And everybody just kind of turned a blind eye because they knew that they were still slaves, but they were, you know what I mean? There was like a gray area, I guess. So you have to trace it all back. But anyway, it says here, despite being a slave owner, Randolph did not engage in the practice of buying or selling slaves himself, and denounced on the floor of the House of Representatives those quote unquote hard-hearted masters who, end quote, who broke up black families by selling their members. Yeah, that's another thing that's crazy to me. Why would you sell family members? Okay, anyway, whatever. Randolph urged the federal government to act in an area where it had legal jurisdiction to ban domestic slave trade in the District of Columbia. The fact that there was no such general support for making domestic slave trading a criminal offense as for making the international slave trade a capital offense reflected the fact that the former did not increase the total number of slaves in the United States. Is it increase or decrease? I can't remember what I just said. Hang on. Oh, okay. It said that the fact that the former did not increase the total number of slaves in the United States, nor take any more people out of Africa. However, being a domestic slave trader was not without social stigma. So people didn't like it, you know? Even in the antebellum South. What? But that's what the slave capital of the world, right? Supposedly, according to our history, right, that they keep telling us. Shoving down our throats, more like it. The moral distinction between slave trading and the continuation of slavery as an institution might be hard for some in later centuries, to understand, because in the abstract, there is no moral difference. Only in the concrete circumstances faced by the people of the times was there a practical social difference. The Civil War that grew out of tensions over slavery was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere and cost more American lives than any other war in the country's history. Whether or not those fighting on either side thought of their battles as being over slavery, as distinguished from secession without slavery, there would have been no secession and no Civil War. The states, I didn't think about that. The states that first seceded were states where slaves were the highest percentage of the population. Contemporary words and deeds by the leaders of the Confederacy made unmistakably clear that slavery was at the heart of their secession and at the heart of the Constitution that they established for their own new government. In later times, as slavery became even more repugnant to the people throughout Western civilization and even beyond. Apologists for the South would stress other factors. But the real question is, what factor moved Southern leaders when the fateful decision was made to secede? And that was, quote unquote, unashamedly, as a Civil War historian put it, slavery. As for the race war that so many had feared, the fact that it did not materialize after emancipation is hardly decisive evidence that the fear was unfounded. During the Civil War, blacks were freed only where Union troops were in occupation of Southern territory, and an army of occupation remained in the South for more than a decade after the Civil War. In the antebellum era, no one on either side of the issue of slavery and emancipation had anticipated that. Even so, the vigilante violence of the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorists, even while under military occupation, suggests that the potential for a race war was quite real. Among the other examples of the anachronistic moral principles being applied in our own times to earlier times have been the many complaints that the Constitution of the United States did not abolish slavery. This was never a viable option because the South would not have remained united with the North if there had been such a clause. The clause would have been an empty symbolic gesture, leaving millions still enslaved in the South, but jeopardizing the existence of a vulnerable new country by splitting it in half at the outset. Even had both North and South survived as independent nations, slaves in the South were highly unlikely to have been freed by 1863. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, would a meaningless clause have been worth the price of condemning even more generations of blacks to slavery? Moral principles cannot be separated from their consequences in a given context. Those preoccupied today with the contemporary instrumental use of history have scored many talking points by referring to the Constitution's allowance of additional representation for the South in Congress by counting 3/5 of the slave population and determining the number of congressmen to which the Southern states would be entitled. Like many political compromises, this one made no sense except as a means of obtaining agreement in a situation where a dangerous stalemate threatened. The talking point made today is that this political arrangement amounted to saying that a black man was only 3/5 as important as a white man. But would those who say this have preferred that the slave population had been counted as requiring the same representation in Congress as the free? What would have been the consequences, or do consequences matter to those trying to score points? I kind of feel like if they would have counted everybody, then there would have been a bigger representation of those who were in favor, potentially in favor of keeping slaves as slaves, right? I'm just saying. Since slaves had no voice whatever in the selection of Southern congressmen, counting the slave population at full strength would only have given white Southerners a stronger pro-slave. This is just what I just said. It's common sense. It's logic, you guys. You gotta let it drive the bus. Always. Don't believe what they're telling you. Frickin' figure it out for yourself. So since slaves had no voice whatever in the selection of Southern congressmen, counting the slave population at full strength would only have given white Southerners a stronger pro-slavery contingent in Congress. Scoring points today and being serious are two very different things. It should also be noted that the Constitution's distinction in counting people for representation in Congress was between slave and free, not black and white. Free blacks were counted the same as whites, y'all. Like, let's be real about it, right? Just like how I told you guys in previous videos that, like, the people who could vote, and it wasn't reading this book, it's just earlier on in my doing lives and whatnot. People who could vote, you could only vote if you owned land. So, like, white people that didn't own land could not freaking vote. Black people that owned land could vote. Okay, that was the rule. Them's the rules, right? Like, come on. Okay. Free blacks were counted the same as whites, and free blacks existed before the Constitution existed. Stop making people think, stop letting people make you think that black people were not free ever and that they were all slaves. Okay? Anyway. And that they were less than whites. I'm just saying. Social consequences in different societies. The situation in the Islamic world was very different from that in the West. Despite the larger total numbers of slaves sent from Africa to the Islamic world over the centuries, The surviving African population in these countries was much less than the tens of millions in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to higher mortality rates of slaves en route to North African and Middle Eastern countries, the survival and reproduction rates of African slaves there were much less than in the United States. While slaves in the antebellum South lived in families, even though they lacked official legal sanction for their marriages, both marriage and casual sex among slaves were suppressed in the Islamic world. And among the relatively small numbers of children born to African slaves, the mortality rate was so high that few lived to adulthood. The sex imbalance among African slaves, far more women than men in the Islamic countries, and the fact that eunuchs were common among the relatively few African men likewise precluded a vast African slave population in the Muslim MOSLEM countries. Among the European galley slaves in North Africa, there was even less chance for them to reproduce, and the European women who were domestic servants or concubines were in no position to leave behind European offspring raised in European culture. The children born to them, fathered by North African or Middle Eastern slave owners, were absorbed both biologically and culturally into the Islamic world. By the late 18th century, visitors were commenting on the lighter complexions of the inhabitants of Algiers, Algiers. What the United States had that the Islamic world did not have was a self-sustaining and racially distinct population of major proportions within the larger society. Non-Western countries in the general faced neither the social nor the moral dilemmas that confronted 19th century Americans. Moreover, the emancipation of slaves was not an issue faced by non-Western societies, but rather was something imposed on them by the West. Even European powers with substantial slave populations in their Western Hemisphere colonies faced no major domestic social consequences from the freeing of those slaves. However, much that might have economic repercussions for their slaves were freed on the other side of the ocean. Both slavery and emancipation were peculiar in their consequences on American soul. It may be significant that the only other independent nation in the Western Hemisphere with a large slave population, Brazil, was the last Western nation to abolish the institution a quarter of a century after the United States. Wow. The legacy of slavery. Slavery has left many legacies, some economic, some social, some psychological, some political, and most detrimental. Economics. Those who think of slavery in economic terms often assume that it is a means by which a society, or at least its non-slave population, becomes richer. Some have even claimed that the Industrial Revolution in Western civilization was based on the profits extracted from the exploitation of slaves. Rather than rehash a large and controversial literature on this issue, we may instead look at the economic condition of countries or regions that used vast numbers of slaves in the past. Both in Brazil and in the United States, the countries with the two largest slave populations in the Western Hemisphere, the end of slavery found that regions in which slaves had been concentrated poorer than other regions of these same countries. For the United States, a case could be made that this was due to the Civil War, which did so much damage to the South, but no such explanation would apply to Brazil, which fought no civil war over this issue. Moreover, even in the United States, the South lagged behind the North in many ways, even before the Civil War. Although slavery in Europe died out before it was abolished in the Western Hemisphere as late as 1776, slavery had not yet died out all across the continent when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. That it still existed in some eastern regions, right? But even then, Eastern Europe was much poorer than Western Europe. The slavery of North Africa and the Middle East over the centuries took more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than the Western Hemisphere shut the front door. The slavery of North Africa and the Middle East over centuries took more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than the Western Hemisphere did. In parentheses, in addition to large imports of slaves from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe to the Muslim MOSLEM countries of North Africa and the Middle East, close parentheses. But these remained largely poor countries until the discovery and extraction of their vast oil deposits. In many parts of the non-Western world, slaves were sources of domestic amenities and means of displaying wealth, oh wow, with an impressive retinue, retinue, rather than sources of wealth. Often they were a drain on the wealth already possessed. According to a scholarly study of slavery in China, the slaves there, in quotes, did not generate any surplus, they consumed it, end quote, end quote. Another study concluded, in quotes, the Middle East and the Arab world rarely use slaves for productive activities, end quote. Even though some slave owners, those whose slaves produced commercial crops or other saleable products, received wealth from the fruits of the unpaid labor of these slaves. That is very different from saying that the society as a whole, or even its non-slave population as a whole, ended up wealthier than it would have been in the absence of slavery. Wow. So in a sense, it was kind of like jewels, or like horses or cows or something. Like the more you had, the more wealthier you seemed, or the more heavy set you were back in the early years, right? Then the more money you had and stuff. Not only in societies where slaves, not only in societies where slaves were more often consumers than producers of wealth, but even in societies where commercial slavery was predominant, this did not automatically translate into enduring wealth, unlike a frugal capitalist class, such as created the Industrial Revolution. Even commercial slave owners in the American antebellum South tended to spend lavishly, often ended up in debt, or even losing their plantations to foreclosures by creditors. However, even if British slave owners had saved, and invested all of their profits from slavery, it would have amounted to less than 2% of the British domestic investment. In the United States, it is doubtful whether the profits of slavery would have covered the enormous cost of the Civil War, a war that was fought over the immediate issue of secession. But the reason for the secession was to safeguard slavery from the growing anti-slavery sentiment outside the South, symbolized by the election of Abraham Lincoln. Brazil, which imported several times as many slaves as the United States. Hold up. Stop it. Brazil, which imported several times as many slaves as the United States, and perhaps consumed more slaves than any other nation in history, was nevertheless still a relatively undeveloped country when slavery ended there in 1888. Now. Have you ever heard about the slavery in Brazil? Because I have not. This is the only time in this book. I mean, I think they mentioned it earlier, right? But I'm trying to tell you that they broke it down Barney style here, saying that Brazil, okay, consumed more slaves than any other nation in history. What the frickin' what, man? And its subsequent economic development was largely the work of immigrants from Europe and Japan. In short, even though some individual slave owners grew rich and some family fortunes were founded on the exploitation of slaves, that is very different from saying that the whole society, or even its non-slave population as a whole, was more economically advanced than it would have been in the absence of slavery. What this means is that, whether employed as domestic servants or producing crops or other goods, millions suffered exploitation and dehumanization for no higher purpose than the transient aggrandizement of slave owners. Social and psychological legacies of slavery. Just as enslaved peoples tend to be despised, so the work done by slaves tended to acquire social stigmas in countries around the world. In Java, JAVA, for example, free people did not want to carry their own packages since slaves carried packages, and therefore free people without slaves would hire a slave for such chores. Carrying your package. Like, come on, man, right? Similarly, in Egypt, work done, but hey, that was what they were doing at the time, right? So what would you not be caught doing right now? Think about that. And what would you hire somebody for? You know, oh, I don't want to break a sweat, but I'll pay that guy to break a sweat, right? Anyway. Similarly, in Egypt, work done by slaves was spurned by working class people even after slavery was over. Sometimes it was not just particular kinds of work, but hard work in general, or work under the direction of a foreman or overseer that was stigmatized. Done to go hang, you, and a good chance to get to a meet again. Love you, minute.